morning light found a freshly welded steel gate bolted across the head of an irrigation ditch, the paint on its crossbar not yet fully cured. Below it, the dry channel ran cracked and empty toward the parched fields of a small ranch at the narrow neck of a drought-starved valley. A woman came walking up that dead channel in the gray of first light, her worn coat buttoned against the chill, stopping. Shortburst when she saw what barred her water. A wealthy rancher waited beside the new fence, mild-voiced and unhurried, and told her she ought to sell before her cattle went down for want of water. She said nothing that would give him the satisfaction of an answer, only looked at the bright bolts sunk deep into the crossbar. That evening, her young daughter stood among a stand of cottonwoods behind the old cattle shed, staring at leaves that held their green while the whole valley had turned to dust. The girl knelt at a crumbling stone wall and pressed her small hand flat against it, and her fingers came away wet. Beneath 30 years of packed earth and silence, something cold was beginning to rise. The morning, Cyrus Thorne bolted a steel gate across the head of the Antler Ditch. He waited beside the new fence line until Adaline Merrow came walking up the dry channel to see for herself, and then he told her, in the mild voice of a man doing her a kindness, that she ought to sell Alder Bench before her cattle went down for want of water. He did not raise his hand or his tone. He simply looked at the cracked bed of the ditch, then at her, and let the silence carry the weight of the thing he had done. Behind him, a fresh weld still smelled faintly of scorched metal in the cool of first light, the paint on the crossbar not yet fully cured. And Adaline understood, without a single figure on paper, that the drought pressing down on Harrow Valley had just found a second face, and that this one belonged to a man. She had risen that day the way she rose every day, before the sun cleared the eastern rim of Kestrel County, when the ranch was still blue with shadow, and the only sound was the barn door dragging on its runner. It was the particular hour she trusted most, the hour when a person could hear a pump falter or a fence wire sing loose in the wind before any trouble grew large enough to see. For 2 years the valley had gone without proper rain, and the land wore that want plainly. Pastures that should have run green by early summer had turned the flat color of road dust. Stock ponds that once held a wagon's reflection had shrunk to muddy coins, ringed with the split prints of thirsty cattle. At the feed store down in Hollis, the price of baled hay climbed nearly every week, and the ranchers who came in to argue it spoke of the weather the way people speak of a sickness in the family, in low, careful voices, without much hope hung on the words. Alder Bench sat at the narrow neck of the valley, 74 acres of grass and gravel that Adaline held against the world with a small herd, a few rows of alfalfa, and a greenhouse she had cobbled together from salvaged window glass and barn lumber. The place had never made her rich. Some seasons it barely carried itself from one winter to the next, but it was the one square of earth that belonged to her and to her daughter both, the one thing that had not been carried off or rearranged by a man's decision, and that fact had come to mean more to her than any ledger could measure. Years back, before the ranch and before the girl, she had hired out as a flume tender and ditch walker for her father, learning to read the pull of water through a headgate the way other people learned to read weather in a sky. She knew valves and grades and the old paper of water rights better than most of her neighbors would ever need to. And for a long while that knowledge had felt like a small private wealth. Now it felt like the only weapon she had left. The ranch drank from the Antler Ditch, a slender lateral that broke off the main canal and crossed a corner of thorn land before it reached her fields. Her deed carried a share of that flow, a right older than either her name or Cyrus Thorne's, a right that had ridden along with the property through 3 owners before her ever set foot on it. The share was not large. In a fat year, it would have been an afterthought. But in a year like this one, it was the difference between a herd that held its condition and a herd that walked the fence line bawling, and every rancher in Harrow Valley understood that arithmetic in his bones. Cyrus Thorne understood it better than anyone, because he had spent the better part of 3 seasons trying to buy her out. Alder Bench sat wedged like a stone in a boot between 2 much larger parcels he He already ran under the brand of Thorne land and cattle, and a man of his appetite could not abide a piece of ground he did not own, sitting square in the middle of his own. He had come to her more than once with an offer, and each time she had turned it down, and each time his figure had crept a little higher, as though the only reason a woman might refuse him was that he had not yet named the right number. He did not seem able to hold the notion that the ranch was not to her a number at all. At the spring meeting of the Kestrel County Stockmen's Association, held in the long room above the Hollis Mercantile, with the windows thrown open against the heat, Cyrus had risen with his thumbs in his vest and remarked to the room, without troubling to name a soul, that a small outfit run on borrowed nerve and too little capital would not last a drought of this size, and that the sooner such places changed hands, the better it would be, for the water everyone shared. Every man in that room knew the shape of the ranch he meant. A few of them let their eyes drift to the back bench, where Adaline sat with her hands folded, and she gave them nothing to carry home. No flush, no flinch, no answer at all. Her stillness, she would learn later, was the very thing that convinced him she was already close to giving way. He read quiet as weakness. It was the first thing he got wrong about her, and it would not be the last. Her daughter Wren was 10 years old that summer and built for noticing. Where other children filled the evening with noise, Wren spent hers along the dry creek bed below the house, gathering stones and sorting them on the porch rail by color and heft, lining them up in a private order that made sense to no one but herself. People took her for a shy child. Adaline knew better. The girl was not timid, only watchful, the kind of watchful that catches the way birds lift off a fence a breath before a wagon rounds the bend, or the particular hush that drops over a pasture when something in it has changed and not yet shown itself. More than once, Adaline had learned to trust a long look from her daughter over her own two eyes, though she would not have said so aloud to anyone in the county. The evening before the gate went up, driving the ridge road home in the wagon, with the last heat of the day settling over the bench seats it, Adaline had marked how the water in the Antler had dropped by half since morning, though nothing in the sky or the season accounted for it. She had told herself a beaver, a slump in the bank, a chore for the coming week. By sunrise, the ditch was bone dry, and she had followed the empty channel up toward the property line, with a cold weight gathering under her ribs, and there at the head of the lateral stood the gate, and there beside it stood the man. He was not alone. Amos Doyle, who had run cattle for Thorne going on 20 years, stood a pace behind his employer, with his hat pushed back and his eyes fixed on some middle distance that was neither the gate nor the woman. The posture of a man who would rather be anywhere the day had another use for him. Cyrus explained, in that same unhurried courtesy he wore like good boots, that the head gate had wanted repair for some time and would stay shut until the work was seen to properly. When she asked him plainly how long the work would take, and whether there was a maintenance order she might read, he offered neither a date nor a document, only a small shrug that told her the matter was already closed in his own mind, and had never been open in the first place. She named the right written into her deed, the share of flow that had come down with the land. He smiled at that, the way a man smiles at a child who has misread a sum, and told her the right had only ever run while the founding family held the ground. A reading of the paper she had never once heard from any lawyer, surveyor, or clerk in all her years of turning it over. In front of Doyle and one other hand who had drifted up to listen, he suggested, almost gently, that she think hard about selling before her stock lost flesh and her land lost worth along with it. Thorne Cattle had lawyers on retainer, he reminded her without quite saying the word, and a small place like hers would find it a long, expensive road to argue anything that dragged. A dry ditch has a way of settling a stubborn mind, he told her, and turned back toward his horse as though the conversation had reached its natural close. Adaline said nothing that would give him the satisfaction of an answer. She stood a moment longer looking at the weld, at the bright bolts sunk into the crossbar, at the paint that had not yet hardened, and she understood something the drought had disguised from her until now. The land dying of thirst had never been the plan. This was the plan. The drought was only the cover it hid behind. She drove into Hollis that same afternoon and laid the matter before Harlan Wick, who chaired the county's ditch commission out of a cramped office behind the land agent's window. Wick was not an unkind man only, a cautious one, the sort who had learned that the safest ruling was usually the one that let a rich neighbor keep his temper. He turned her deed over in his hands, hummed at the water right clause, and told her this looked to him like a civil quarrel between neighbors rather than a commission matter, and that he would see her file reviewed within 30 days. 30 days. She thanked him because there was no profit in doing otherwise, and she walked back out into the white glare of the street, already doing the arithmetic that would rule the rest of her summer. Her stored water, the 2 roofed cisterns, and the half-full pond behind the house would not carry the herd past the second week. 30 days was a length of time that belonged to men who still had water. So she began to haul. There was a shallow reach of the Bittern River 9 miles off, where a person could back a wagon down the gravel and fill barrels by the bucket. And Adaline rented what tanks and barrels she could afford and set to it. She left before first light to beat the worst of the heat, the team leaning into the traces on the long pull home, and she learned the sounds of the work the way she had once learned the sounds of a flume. She learned the low sloshing groan, the full barrels made against the wagon bed on the washboard stretches of the county road, and the different hollow knock they gave on the ride back, empty. Once the water had gone into the troughs, her hands cracked and split at the knuckles from the hose fittings and the rope. Her shoulders ached in a way that had nothing to do with her years and everything to do with the same motion done 100 times before noon. Wren began rising in the dark without being asked, so that when her mother came in there was coffee on the stove and the cattle already counted, the girl, moving through the chores with a seriousness that pinched at Adaline's heart worse than any complaint could have. Neither of them spoke much about the shape of things. It was not that they hid it from each other. It was that saying it out loud seemed to add weight the day could not spare. More than once, Adaline caught herself running the figures as she drove. The weeks of fuel for the team, the rented barrels, the falling condition of the stock against the rising price of everything. And more than once, she made herself stop before the fear could get into her hands on the reins. The second week brought a letter. Cyrus had put a fresh offer on paper, and this one had fallen nearly a third below the last, with a single line written beneath the figure in a clerk's neat hand, observing that land without dependable water only lost value the longer the trouble ran. She read it twice at the kitchen table, folded it along its creases, and set it under the sugar tin without an answer, because an answer was the one thing that would tell him his gate had done its work. Word traveled Kestrel County the way it always did, faster than any wagon and crueler than the truth. Within days, people were saying that Adaline Merrow had bought Alder Bench without troubling to check its water rights, a telling that made her sound careless where she had been wronged. And it took hold because it was easier to repeat than the harder story underneath it. Neighbors who had lifted a hand from the wheel when they passed her on the road now found something to study out the far window instead, unwilling to be seen taking the side of a small woman against a man as woven into the county as Cyrus Thorne. The bank made its interest known as well. A loan officer had heard the ranch's water was in dispute and wanted assurance the note on her equipment still made sense on paper. She answered every question plainly by return letter and folded each notice away, a little more aware of how quickly a rumor could harden into a debt. Thorne did not need to raise his voice to be heard. He let the story do it for him, and where the story flagged, he fed it. At the Grange Hall, he spoke to anyone who would still about the duty a man owed his neighbors to guard the county's water in a dry year, and about the danger that came when green owners, new to the ground, thought a deed entitled them to more than the land could bear. He never once used her name. He did not have to. By the following evening, 3 separate people had mentioned the speech to her at the feed store. Watching her face while they said it, she tried the old well behind the house, the one her father-in-law had drilled a generation back before the family had ever fractured. and the pump brought up mud and a dry, rattling breath, no matter how long she worked the handle. A driller down from the county seat looked it over, sucked his teeth, and quoted her a figure for a new bore that would have swallowed most of what remained in her account, with no promise the new hole would strike anything sweeter than the last. She thanked him and did not sign. Cyrus came out to the ranch himself one afternoon, a folded contract already prepared, and signed on his end riding in his coat, and told her that if she put her name to it that same day he would let her and the girl keep the house through the winter before they had to move on. When she said no again, he let his eyes travel to the row of empty barrels lined up along the barn wall and observed almost kindly that pride was a poor thing to water a herd with. Adaline swung the yard gate shut in front of him without lifting her voice, and she spent the rest of that evening at the kitchen table with a stub of pencil, doing the sum she had been avoiding for a week, and the sum came out the same no matter how she arranged it. She would have to sell down the herd. Fewer head meant less water, and less water meant a few more weeks of holding on, even if it meant taking a buyer's price in a bad season for cattle worth twice that in a good one. She made the decision the way she made every hard decision, alone at night with the lamp low, and in the morning she began pulling the ear tags from the cows chosen to go. Wren watched her do it from the corral rail, saying nothing. There was a knowing in the girl's stillsomeness that Adaline could not quite meet. That evening, after the buyer's wagon had rattled off down the road with a dozen head, Wren did not come in for supper at the usual hour. Adaline found her out along the eastern edge of the property, where the old cattle shed leaned into a stand of cottonwoods, and the girl was standing very still, looking at the trees. "They're still green," Wren said, not turning around. "Everything else went brown weeks back. These didn't." Adaline looked where her daughter looked. The cottonwoods behind the failing shed held their leaves in a soft living green that had no business surviving a summer like this one, a green that drew the eye precisely because the whole rest of the valley had surrendered its color. It was the kind of thing a person walked past 100 times without seeing, and the kind of thing her daughter had been built to catch. They went to the shed together in the last of the light. The building had never been more than a landmark to Adaline, a leaning, gray structure she passed on her way to check the far fence, its roof half fallen, its walls swallowed each spring by wild grass gone to seed. Behind it ran a low stone wall she had always taken for the boundary of some old corral, laid up by whoever had ranched the ground before her family's name ever went on the deed. She had never given it a second thought. Now in the cooling dusk, Wren crouched at the base of that wall and laid her small hand flat against a crumbling stretch of stone, and looked up at her mother with a question already forming. "It's cold," the girl said. "Feel it." Adaline knelt and pressed her palm to the stone, and it was cold, distinctly and impossibly cold, colder than the dirt around it, cold in the way a thing is cold when water runs near it, in a season and a place where nothing had held moisture for weeks. Along a cracked seam of stone near the ground grew a strip of moss, low and damp and living, and she touched that too, and her fingertips came away wet. Her first thought was a broken line. Somewhere an old irrigation pipe had let go and was bleeding into the ground, and the green trees, and the cold wall, and the moss were nothing more than a leak she would have to find, and cap before it drained what little she had. It was the reasonable thought, the thought of a woman who had spent her life around pipe. She held to it that night at the kitchen table, while she unrolled the ranch's original piping diagrams, the brittle sheets her father had kept, and she ran her finger along every line of the system twice, and not one of them passed within 200 feet of that wall. Whatever fed the moss and cooled the stone and kept the cottonwoods green, it did not come from any pipe she owned or any line ever drawn on her land. She sat a long while with the diagrams flattened under the lamp and the wet still on her fingertips, and something turned over in her chest that she could not put a name to. Somewhere between disbelief and the old caution she had learned the hard way not to ignore. She had spent 2 years watching the sky refuse her, watching her savings thin and her neighbors look away, watching a man with fresh paint on a gate try to price her out of the only ground that was hers. And now here was cold water, rising toward the surface, behind an old shed she had walked past 10,000 times. In ground, the drought had emptied of everything else, as though it had been waiting there in the dark all along for someone to finally kneel down and notice it. She did not let herself hope. Hope was a luxury she had learned to ration as carefully as water. But she rolled the diagrams and put them away. And she banked the lamp. And she stood a while at the window, looking east, toward the black shape of the shed. And she made herself gray of the sky. And she made herself small hard that wall. She would not leave it to chance, and she would not let it be taken before she even understood what it was. Morning came gray and windless, the kind of stillness that sat over the valley like a held breath. Adaline was at the wall before Wren was fully awake, a length of iron probe rod carried down from the barn, and she pushed it into the soil a foot from the stones and felt it slide in far easier than it had any right to, the ground soft and giving, where every other yard of the ranch had baked to brick. She worked the rod along the base of the wall and found the softness ran the length of it, a buried seam of yielding earth in a summer that had turned the whole county to fired clay. When she knelt and put her ear to a gap between two stones, holding her own breath to steady the quiet, she heard it, faint but past all mistaking, the low continuous voice of moving water somewhere below the wall. She sent Wren back to the house with an errand invented on the spot, wanting the girl clear of whatever the next hour turned up, wanting her daughter's part in this to stay small and safe. Then she fetched a bar and a hand mattock from the barn and set to the wall with a care that had nothing of haste in it, prying loose the topmost stones one at a time and setting each aside in the grass, reading the joints as she went. The stones had been laid dry, without mortar, but the gaps between them had been packed tight long ago with a stiff clay that did not belong to any natural fall of the wall. Someone had sealed this. Someone had taken real trouble to close it. As she lifted the fourth course away, she uncovered a low arched opening behind the wall, a throat of fitted stone leading down into dark. The collapsed mouth of what she slowly understood was a spring house, a small roofed chamber built directly over rising water in the old way, before pumps and pipe sealed shut and grassed over and forgotten. One flat stone at the base of the arch, half sunk in the packed earth, carried a shallow carving worn nearly smooth by time and weather. She brushed the dirt from it with her thumb and found two letters she could not make out, and below them a date cut deep enough to have survived the years. 1851. She sat back on her heels and looked at that number a long moment, doing a different kind of arithmetic now, the kind that measured how long a thing could wait in the dark before someone came for it. She did not tear the opening wide. Every instinct she owned as a water hand told her to go slow, that a source she did not understand could be fouled by haste, that a chamber sealed 30 years or more could bring its own roof down on the flow if she pulled the wrong stone. She cleared instead a narrow channel along the outer edge of the arch, easing the packed clay away a handful at a time. And where she worked, the surrounding soil went dark and wet almost at once, and a thin thread of water began to seep out and pool in the grass. Cold and clear, nothing at all like the cloudy iron-tasting water her old well had ever grudged her. She caught some in a clean jar. She held it to the gray morning light and turned it, and it was clear as glass. She made herself stop there. She wanted to dig with both hands until the whole thing lay open to the sky. Instead, she touched nothing she could not put back, and she drove into Hollis and sent word to Elias Penrose, a retired surveyor and well man who had helped half the ranches in the county sort out a bad bore or a dry hole over the years, and who had a reputation for saying only what the ground actually told him, and not one word past it. Penrose came out the following afternoon, an old man with a young man's steadiness in his hands, and he walked the length of the wall twice before he crouched at the opened arch and studied the stonework in a long, unhurried silence. He fitted a short length of pipe into the seep as a rough gauge and watched the water climb it and hold. And when he finally spoke, it was slow, the way a careful man lays out a thing he does not want misheard. "This was built on purpose," he said, running a thumb along the old joint of the arch. "That's a spring house, laid over live water, and a good one. Somebody who knew exactly what they were doing put this here." He looked up at her from under the brim of his hat. "And here's the part you'll want to sit with. It didn't dry up on its own and get buried by time. Somebody sealed it. Somebody closed a working spring, packed it tight, and walked away, and did it on purpose." Adaline stood over him, with the jar of clear water still in her coat pocket, and felt the ground of the whole summer shift a quarter turn beneath her. Why would a person seal up good water in a country that's dying for it? Penrose did not answer that. He fitted his temporary gauge more securely and read the pressure holding steady in the pipe. And he told her the thing that mattered most, the thing that turned the discovery from a curiosity into a lifeline. The Antler Ditch beyond her fence was dry as a bone, and had been for weeks. This water had not risen with any rain, and it did not fall when the ditch fell. Whatever it came from, it was not the flow that Cyrus Thorne had bolted shut. It answered to a different master under the ground, and that single fact meant Alder Bench was not, after all, entirely at the mercy of the man who held the gate. He gathered his tools as the light went, long and gold, across the pasture, and at the wagon he paused with one boot on the wheel hub and looked back at her. And there was something in his face that was not quite warning and not quite pity. "You'll want to keep this quiet as long as you can," he said. "Because if this spring is what it looks like it is, a man like Thorne is not going to let it lie once he hears of it. Water this good, in a year this dry, on land he's already trying to take." He shook his head slowly. "You didn't just find water, Mrs. Merrow. You found the one thing he can't afford for you to have." She stood in the yard after his wagon had dropped over the ridge, and the dust of it had settled back into the road, and she looked east toward the shed, and the opened wall and the dark patch of wet grass spreading slow in the last of the light. Wren came out onto the porch behind her and did not speak, only came and stood at her side and slipped a hand into hers, and together they watched the place where cold water was working its patient way up, out of ground that had held it hidden for 30 years and more. "Is it going to help us?" the girl asked at last, her voice small in the wide quiet of the evening. Adaline looked down at her daughter, at the stones still cupped in the girl's free hand, sorted by some private order only she understood. And she thought about the 30 days the commission had given her that she did not have, and the letter under the sugar tin, and the herd walking thinner every week, and the man who had told her the land would die of thirst, as though he were doing her the favor of the truth. "It might," she said, and she squeezed the small hand in hers. "But water like this doesn't just save a person. Not when somebody with money's already decided it's his." She turned her daughter gently back toward the house and the lamp burning in the window. "The finding was the easy part, Wren. Holding on to it is where the real work starts." She banked the fire that night and did not sleep much. She lay listening to the house settle in the dark and thinking of the two carved letters she could not read, and the date she could, 1851, and of the hands that had laid those stones, and the hands that had sealed them shut, and of the reason a person might close a working spring in a dry country and grass it over and tell no one. Somewhere under her own land ran cold, clear water that answered to no gate and no man's paint, and somewhere in the paper she had not yet found lay the story of who had hidden it and why. And out past the ridge, in the big house on the far parcel, a man who priced everything and understood almost nothing was going about his evening, not yet knowing that the ground he meant to take had been keeping a secret longer than he had been alive, a secret that had just, at the touch of a 10-year-old's hand, begun to rise. The seep did not stay a seep. Within 2 days of Penrose's first visit, the thin thread of water Adaline had coaxed from the arch had widened to a streaked trickle that darkened a full apron of grass below the wall, and it was that visible spreading that undid her patience. She had promised herself to go slow. She had told her own reflection in the dark window that a source she did not understand could be ruined by haste. But the herd was still walking the fence in the heat. The barrels still went out empty every dawn and came back heavy. And each night, the sum under the sugar tin grew a little worse, and standing over that widening patch of wet with the whole valley baking around it, she let the wanting get ahead of the knowing. She worked the arch open further than Penrose had counseled, prying loose a lower course of stone to clear what she believed was a choke of old clay, damming the flow. And for a moment it seemed she had judged it right. The water surged, cold and full, rising over her wrists where she reached into the dark to pull the packed earth free. Then a stone above her hand shifted where it had held for 30 years, and a second slid after it, and the old throat of the spring house folded inward with a soft, heavy sigh, dropping 100 pounds of fitted rock and dirt into the very channel she had opened. The clear water went brown in an instant, thick with silt and grit, and the confident rising she had watched with something close to joy slowed to a muddy weep between the Falton stones. She sat back hard in the wet grass with her hands filthy to the elbow and her heart gone cold, understanding that in her hurry she had buried the things she had spent a week uncovering. She did not weep over it. Weeping was another luxury the summer had priced beyond her reach. She sat in the ruin of her own impatience and made herself look at exactly what she had done. The collapsed arch, the fouled water, the stones she could not simply lift back into place without knowing how they had keyed together in the first place. Penrose, when she rode into Hollis to fetch him, did not scold her, which was somehow worse than if he had. He came out, studied the slump for a long while with his hat in his hand, and told her the flow was not lost, only choked, that the spring itself ran too deep and too strong to be stopped by one man's collapse or one woman's mistake. But that clearing it properly, now, would take careful work and settling time, days at the least, days she did not have to spare while the herd thinned, and the offer sat waiting under her sugar tin. "You reached for it too fast," he said, not unkindly, packing his measuring pipe away. "Water rewards patience, Mrs. Merrow. It always has. It'll come back to you clean if you let it settle. But it won't be hurried, no matter how bad the hurry is." She had barely begun the slow work of clearing the fall when the second blow came, and it came dressed in paper and a stranger's boots. A courier rode out from the county seat on a hired horse and put a folded document into her hands at her own gate, and she read it standing in the yard, with the dust of his leaving still hanging in the air. Cyrus Thorne had gone to law. The filing sought an emergency order to halt all activity at what it called the disputed water source on the Merrow parcel until ownership could be established before the commission, and it had been drawn not by any local hand, but by a regional firm out of the capital, a firm whose name she had seen only on the letterhead of men far wealthier than herself. The language was smooth and cold and turned everything on its head. It described Alder Bench as an under-resourced operation, posing a real risk of contaminating a shared underground supply, and it asked that she be barred from drawing so much as a bucket while the matter was investigated. The woman who had been wronged had been rewritten, in the space of a single page, into the threat. She understood at once how the thing had reached him. She had filed nothing yet, spoken to no one but Penrose, and still Thorne knew. A clerk at the county office had mentioned her inquiries about the old parcel to someone who carried water for Thorne land and cattle, and the word had traveled the short crooked distance from courthouse to ranch house before she had even settled the collapse behind her shed. There were no secrets in Kestrel County that a rich man could not buy the telling of. The timing of it landed on her like a second roof falling. The spring was choked and muddy from her own haste, unusable until it settled and cleared, and now a court order threatened to freeze even that ruined flow before she could restore it, while the herd she had already cut into walked thinner every day, and the money to fight a capital firm did not exist in any drawer she owned. That night she took the signed contract out from under the sugar tin and unfolded it on the table, and sat looking at Thorne's name inked at the bottom and the blank line above her own. And for the first time since the gate went up, she let herself feel how close the edge had come. A few strokes of a pen would end the hauling, and the arithmetic and the neighbors' averted eyes. It would also end everything the ground was, the green cottonwoods and the cold stone and the date carved 1851, all of it signed away to the man who had tried to price her off it. She sat there until the lamp guttered low and the coffee went cold at her elbow. The pen actually in her hand once. And she set it down, and she folded the contract back along its creases, and she put it away. Not tonight. Not while there was still one road she had not walked to its end. The public campaign began the next morning, and it was quieter and more poisonous than the lawsuit. Thorne did not shout, he wrote. A letter appeared under his name in the Hollis Ledger, reasonable in tone and ruinous in aim, warning the county that a newcomer had stumbled onto an ancient source of water and meant to lay private claim to what rightly belonged to the whole valley in a time of drought. He spoke of stewardship. He spoke of the danger of letting a single struggling ranch seize control of water that every family downstream might one day need. He never wrote her name, but the shape of her sat plain in every line, and where the letter left off, his voice at the Grange Hall carried it further, painting her as a threat to the very neighbors she was trying to survive among. People who had felt a flicker of sympathy for the woman hauling water at dawn now had a nobler reason to look away, and some of them took it. A rancher she had once traded hay with crossed the street in Hollis rather than pass her on the walk. Penrose came back with proper instruments, while the ledger letter was still folded on kitchen tables across the county, and he brought a young man to help him clear the collapse the right way, stone by stone, keying each block back into its neighbor as they went down, so the throat would hold when the water rose again. It took 2 full days of careful work, the settling time he had warned her of, and Adaline spent them hauling water at dawn as always, and clearing rubble at dusk, sleeping 4 hours and rising to do it again. But on the third morning the flow ran clear once more, clearer than before, and Penrose fitted his gauge and read it, and let out a low whistle through his teeth. 18 gallons a minute when I first pipped it, he said, watching the water climb his glass. He waited, read it again as the last of the settling cleared. It's better than that now that we've opened the intake proper. This is climbing past 40. He looked up at her, and the caution in his face had given a little ground to wonder. 40 gallons a minute, Mrs. Merrow, in the worst dry year this valley has seen in a generation. That's your house, your herd, your greenhouse, your fields, and enough left over to matter. This isn't a lucky seep. This is a river you can't see. He would not let her celebrate long. She could not simply set a pipe and start pumping, he reminded her, not without a permit from the commission, not without a test of the water's fitness, not without a formal recognition of who owned a spring that appeared on no modern paper. An unregistered source carried its own snares, even on ground a person held free and clear, and to draw from it in defiance of a pending court order would hand Thorne exactly the club he was reaching for. Then, kneeling at the cleared intake with his hands in the wet, Penrose found something that changed the shape of the question entirely. Bedded in the packed floor of the old chamber, running off toward the direction of a long collapside storage barn on the far side of the shed, lay a length of glazed ceramic pipe, cracked and root-bound but unmistakable, the kind of pipe a person laid to carry water somewhere it was needed every day. Somebody used this, he said, turning a shard of the old glaze in his fingers. Regular. Daily. This wasn't a spring somebody found and forgot. Somebody built their whole life around it once, ran a line clear to the yard, drank from it and watered stock from it, and did it for years. He set the shard down gently, as though it were a thing that could still bruise. Springs like this one aren't accidents of the ground, Mrs. Merrow. Somebody a long way back knew exactly what was under here, and knew what it was worth, and took real trouble to make proper use of it. And then somebody took just as much trouble to bury it. That's the part that ought to keep you up at night. It did. She spent that night at the table with every scrap of paper the ranch had ever gathered, spread out under the lamp, the brittle diagrams, the deed, the abstracts of titles she had bought in a bundle when she took the place, and she read every line searching for a single mention of a spring, a source, a well beyond the sour one behind the house. She found nothing, not one word, and the nothing unsettled her more than any threatening letter had, because water this reliable, this deliberately built upon, should have left a track through the paper somewhere. A right this good, did not simply vanish from the record of a piece of land. It was removed. Someone had wanted it gone from the paper as surely as they had wanted it gone from the ground. By morning, she had stopped waiting for the world to hand her the answer and decided to go dig it out herself. She filed her own petition with the commission, a formal request to recognize the spring and to restore its original intake. And she did it plainly and in the open, no longer trying to keep the thing quiet now that Thorne already knew. Then she sat down with her own deed again, this time not searching for what was there, but reading for what had been worn thin and buried deep in an old appendix she had skimmed 100 times. She found a line she had never once stopped on, a reference, in the cramped hand of some long-dead clerk, to a spring house at a place called Still Hollow, and alongside it a note that a survey map recording the same had been filed with the county in an earlier year, a map that did not appear anywhere in the abstract she held. She took the deed to Ezra Vane, a lawyer who had spent a working life on land and water quarrels across the territory and had lately half-retired to a small practice above the Hollis harness shop. A lean gray man with ink permanently in the creases of his fingers and a reputation for being thorough where flashier men were merely loud. He read the appendix line twice, and his eyebrows drew down, and he tapped the page. Still Hollow, he said. That's the name that matters here, not whatever they're calling it now. And a survey map filed and then gone missing from the abstract is not a thing that happens by accident, Mrs. Merrow. Paper doesn't wander off on its own. Somebody walks it off. He set the deed down. Thorne can afford to drag this out for months. Longer. He's betting your money runs dry before the case ever reaches a floor, so we don't fight him where he's strong. We go find the paper he's counting on nobody finding. He would not take the fight for her, and she did not ask him to. What he offered was a way through, not a rescue, and that suited her better than any promise of rescue could have. He named the place to start. Much of Alder Bench's oldest paper, he told her, from the years before the county reorganized its records, had never been copied into the current books at all. It sat where it had always sat, in the archive room in the courthouse basement, in boxes no one had opened in decades. If a Still Hollow survey still existed anywhere in Kestrel County, that was where it would be. They drove down to the county seat together the next morning, Vane in his black coat, despite the heat, and Adaline, with the collapse behind her at last cleared, and the flow running clean under a canvas she had laid over the intake to keep out the dust. Obadiah Finch kept the records room, a stooped, patient man who had spent 30 years as the memory of a county that did not much value memory. And when Vane explained what they were, after he nodded as though he had been expecting the question for years. Most of the old Alder Bench file never got copied into the new books, Finch said, leading them down a flight of stone steps into a low room that smelled of dust and mildewed paper and the particular cold that lives underground. Reorganization of 74 only carried forward what the clerk of the day thought worth carrying. A great deal got left in the boxes, and the boxes, well. He gestured at the wooden shelving that ran the length of the room, packed floor to ceiling with cartons whose labels had faded past reading. The boxes are the boxes. Nobody's had cause to trouble them in a long while. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, by lamplight, Vane methodical, with a list of dates penciled on a legal pad, Adaline pulling carton after carton and lifting out sheaves of brittle yellowed paper that crumbled at the corners when she turned them. The room was cold enough to raise gooseflesh even with the valley baking overhead, and the silence in it was the deep silence of things long undisturbed. She found herself moved against the urgency of the errand by the sheer weight of the county's forgotten history stacked around her, generation upon generation, of families who had quarreled over the same storm dry heels long before Cyrus Thorne drew his first breath, their disputes and deeds and hard-won rights reduced now to paper going soft in the dark. Finch brought them coffee in tin cups and left them to it, checking back every hour with a carton he thought might bear on the search. It was past full dark when Vane went still over an open ledger, one finger pinning a line. Adaline came to look over his shoulder. It was a survey ledger, The cover stamped 1866, and in a clean surveyor's hand it described a spring, named plainly as the Still Hollow source, as lying wholly within the boundaries of the parcel that had later become Alder Bench Ranch. She read the line twice to be sure of it. The spring was hers, not by luck of geography or hope of interpretation, but by the recorded finding of a county surveyor 2 decades before she was born. Vane was not finished. His finger moved down the page to a second entry, and he read it slowly, and then he read it again aloud, and his voice had changed. The same ledger recorded that the owner of the parcel at the time had been granted a right-of-way, a formal easement, to run a wooden flume across the neighboring ground to carry the Still Hollow water where it was needed. And the neighboring ground the flume crossed was the very land that had since been swallowed into the Thorne holdings. Do you understand what this is? Vane took off his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose, and there was something almost disbelieving in the set of his mouth. You don't just have a claim to the spring, Mrs. Merrow. You have a recorded right to cross Thorne's land to reach and maintain it, his fence, his gate, his whole notion that he controls what touches your water. This says the law handed you a road through his ground half a century ago and never took it back. He set the spectacles down on the open ledger. This changes everything if we can prove it stands. The if arrived a heartbeat later, and it was a cruel one. Vane turned the page to read the surveyor's final determination, the decision that would have made the whole finding binding. And the page was not there. It had been cut from the ledger, cleanly, close to the binding, the ragged inner margin of it still caught in the stitching. Not torn in haste, not lost to rot or handling. Removed. Someone had opened this ledger before them, found the very page that mattered most, and cut it out, leaving the finding hanging without its conclusion, so that a clever lawyer could stand up in front of the commission and argue the right had lapsed, been revoked, never been finalized at all. Adaline stood over the mutilated ledger in the cold lamplit room and felt the discovery and the theft of it land in the same breath. The exhilaration and the betrayal so close together. She could not have named where one ended. Someone had been here before her. Someone had known exactly what this ledger held and exactly which page to remove. And that meant the burying of the spring, and the vanishing of the map, and the cutting of this page were not three accidents scattered across the decades, but one long, careful hand, reaching out of the past to keep her from the water under her own feet. He's been here, she said quietly, her voice flat in the dead air of the room. Or someone for him. This isn't old, Ezra. Look at the cut. This was done clean by somebody who knew right where to look. Vane ran his thumb along the severed margin, and the line of his mouth hardened. Then he knew about Still Hollow before you ever turned to stone, he said. A man doesn't cut a page he's never read. Whoever took this knew what it said and knew it had to disappear. He closed the ledger slowly over its wound, which tells us the page existed, and existed in a form worth destroying. And a thing that was written once can be written twice. Copies get made. Surveys get filed in more than one place, especially in country the railroad once owned. Finch, when they called him down and showed him the cut, went pale and then quiet, and he stood over the ruined ledger with the particular grief of a man who has watched something he was charged to protect be violated on his watch. But he had spent 30 years in these boxes, and after a while his memory began to work. Much of the land in Harrow Valley, he told them, all the ground the Thorne holdings sat on and a good deal beyond, had belonged to the railroad before it was ever sold off to settlers. Granted to the company in the great land conveyances of the 60s and parceled out afterward. And the railroad, he said, had been a careful keeper of its own paper. A survey the county filed on land the railroad owned would very likely have been copied into the railroad's own land office records, filed away in the company archive against exactly the kind of dispute that was now bearing down on Alder Bench. If there's a duplicate of that 1866 survey anywhere on this earth, Finch said, wrapping the wounded ledger in a cloth as though it were an injured thing, it's in the Overland and Western's land records. They kept everything. They had to. Half their business was proving who owned what after they'd sold it. He named the division office where such records would be held, a depot town 300 miles east across two territories, on the far side of a rail journey that would eat days she was not sure she had. Vane drew out his pocket watch and turned its face toward the lamp, and the gravity in him deepened. The commission had set its preliminary hearing on Thorne's emergency filing, and the date left them when Adaline counted it against the calendar. 5 days. 5 days, and the one piece of paper that could turn the whole matter, the intact survey with its final determination whole, sat 300 miles away in a railroad archive that might or might not still hold it, that might have culled it in some housekeeping purge a decade past, that no clerk had any reason to have troubled with since the last century. She stood in the cold basement with the cut ledger wrapped in Finch's cloth and the weight of the arithmetic settling over her. A different arithmetic than the one under her sugar tin, but every bit as merciless. She could send a wire and pray a stranger 300 miles away would care enough to search a room full of forgotten boxes for a woman he had never met, or she could go herself. The hauling would fall to Wren and to Penrose's young helper for the days she was gone. The spring would run untended under its canvas. The herd would thin another notch, and there was no promise at the end of it, no guarantee the paper still drew breath in that far archive. Only the certainty that if she sat home and waited for the wire that never came, she would walk into that hearing with a mutilated ledger and a lawyer's clever argument and lose the water her daughter had found. "I'll go," she said, and the deciding of it settled something in her chest that had been loose since the courier put the filing in her hand. A wire can be ignored. A woman standing in the room asking is harder to turn away. If that page is out there, I'll be the one to put my hand on it. Vane studied her a long moment in the lamplight, and then he nodded, the nod of a man who had learned not to argue with a settled thing. "Then go fast, and go careful," he said, "because the moment Thorne's people understand what you're after, they will do everything money can do to see that paper stays lost. You found the spring, Mrs. Merrow. Now go find the proof that it was always meant to be yours." She drove home in the dark with the cut ledger on the seat beside her, past the black shape of Thorne's big house on the far parcel, where a single window still burned yellow against the night. And she did not slow or look at it long. Wren was awake when she came in, sitting up in the lamplight with a book she was not reading. And Adaline sat on the edge of the girl's bed and told her, in the plainest words she could find, that she had to go away for a few days, on the train, to find a paper that would help them keep the water. The girl took it in with that grave stillness that never failed to pinch at her mother's heart. "You'll be here when it's over?" Wren asked, and there was a whole summer of averted eyes and thinning cattle and men at the gate folded into the smallness of the question. Adaline smoothed the hair back from her daughter's forehead. "I have never once left you for good, and I never will," she said. "This is a trip, not a leaving. There's a difference, and you're old enough to know it." She thought of the days ahead, the 300 miles, the archive that might already have thrown the paper on a fire. Some things a person has to go and get with her own two hands, because nobody else will care enough to look. This is one of them. But I am coming back, and when I do, we are going to be all right. You have my word on it, and my word is the one thing in this county nobody's managed to buy. She left before dawn, as she had left every morning that summer. But this time the wagon carried her only as far as the Hollis station, where she stood on the plank platform in the gray light with a small valise and the cut ledger wrapped in Finch's cloth, watching the eastbound headlamp swell out of the dark and hearing the rails begin to sing under the weight of a thing she could not yet see coming. Somewhere 300 miles east lay a page a dead surveyor had written and a living hand had tried to erase, and she was going to stand in a stranger's archive and ask for it with 5 days on the calendar and a hearing at the end of them. And everything her daughter had found, waiting on whether the paper had survived the long dark of the boxes, as stubbornly as the water had survived the long dark of the ground. The division land office at Fenwick Junction was a low brick building, crouched beside the roundhouse. Its windows filmed with coal soot, its front room manned by a clerk, named Josiah Pruitt, who looked up at the dust-worn woman in the doorway, with the particular weariness of a man who spent his days telling people the paper they wanted did not exist. Adaline had ridden 2 days and a night to reach him, sleeping upright against the window glass while the country rolled past dry and endless, and she came to his counter with the cut ledger under her arm and nothing to offer but the truth in her own stubbornness. He heard her out with his hands flat on the counter, and when she finished, he shook his head slowly and told her the company's old survey records ran to thousands of boxes, that a good portion had been water damaged in a depot fire years back, that he had neither the men nor the hours to send someone digging through half a century of land conveyances for a single county filing on the word of a rancher's widow from 3 territories over. "I understand you've come a long way," Pruitt said, already reaching to square the papers on his counter into a stack that signaled the conversation's end. "But I can't turn this office upside down for a survey that likely burned in '79 and might never have been copied here to begin with. The company's business is what's on the current books, ma'am, not what somebody wishes was." Adaline did not move from the counter. She had come too far to be dismissed by a tired man's arithmetic, and she had learned that summer that the difference between losing and holding often came down to who was willing to stand in a room longest. She set the cut ledger down on the counter between them and opened it to the mutilated page, to the ragged inner margin where the finding had been sliced away, and she turned it so he could see the wound in it. "Somebody cut this out of the county's book," she said, keeping her voice level and low, the voice she used on a spooked animal. "Went into a courthouse basement, found the one page that proved my right, and took a knife to it. That tells me the page was worth destroying, and a thing worth destroying once is worth a great deal to the person it was stolen from." She laid her hand flat on the open ledger. "Your company sold my land to the family that sold it to me. Your company ran the flume easement across ground. It granted the man who's now trying to take my water. Whatever's in your boxes about Still Hollow, the Overland and Western wrote it, filed it, and profited by it. I'm not asking you to invent a paper. I'm asking you to look for one your own company had every reason to keep." Something in the plainness of it reached him where an appeal to pity would not have. Pruitt looked at the cut margin a long moment, then at the woman who had not raised her voice or wept or threatened, only stated a fact and waited on it. He rubbed a hand across his jaw. He asked her the year, the county, the surveyor's name if she had it, the legal description of the parcel, and she gave him each in turn from the intact portion of the ledger, and he wrote them down on a scrap in a cramped hand. He would give her the afternoon, he said, no more, because the survey division kept its own indexing separate from the conveyance books, and if a county filing had been duplicated, it would sit under the year of the original survey, rather than the year of any sale. It was a thin thread. But it was a thread, and she followed him back through a door into a long unlit room where the boxes climbed to the rafters, and the air lay thick with the smell of old paper and machine oil drifting in from the shops next door. They worked into the failing light, Pruitt, pulling boxes by their year stamps, and Adaline lifting out folded surveys stiff as shingle, unfolding each with fingers that had gone raw again from the sharp edges of old paper. The depot fire had reached this room. Whole runs of boxes bore the brown scorch of water and smoke along their bottoms, their contents fused into solid bricks of ruined paper that came apart in her hands like ash. Twice she found the year she wanted and pulled the box down with her heart climbing, only to find the survey she sought was not in it, or was a fragment charred past reading. The light through the soot-filmed windows went from gray to gold to the deep blue of evening, and Pruitt lit a lamp against the dark and told her, not unkindly, that he could give her perhaps another hour before he had to lock the office for the night. It was in that last hour, in a box whose lower third had gone brown with old water, but whose upper contents had somehow escaped the worst of it, that her hand closed on a folded survey stamped 1866, the paper foxed but whole, and she carried it to the lamp with a care she had not shown the collapsed arch, and she unfolded it under the light, and it was there, all of it. The still hollow source recorded within the bounds of what was now her land, the flume easement across the neighboring ground, drawn plain in a surveyor's careful line, and below it, whole and unmutilated, the final determination that had been cut from the county's book. The right to the water at Still Hollow, the finding read, ran with the ownership of the parcel, regardless of family name or any later change of hands, and it did not lapse, and it had never been revoked. The very words a knife had tried to erase from the world sat here 300 miles away, in a company that had forgotten it owned them. She stood in the lamplit dark, with the whole survey open in her hands, and felt something she had not let herself feel since the courier put the filing in her palm. Not triumph exactly, but the deep, settling certainty of a thing proven past argument. Pruitt leaned over the paper beside her and read the determination, and let out a low breath. "Well," he said, and there was a new respect in the tired lines of his face. "There it is. Somebody wanted this gone bad enough to break into a courthouse for it. And they missed the copy." He straightened and looked at her. "You were right to come yourself, ma'am. A wire would have landed on my desk under 40 others, and I'd have written back that it likely burned. It's the standing in the room that moves a thing. Always has been." There was more in the box, and it was Pruitt who found it while she was still reading the determination over for the third time, unwilling to trust her own eyes. Folded in with the survey and its attachments lay a letter, and he drew it out and glanced at it. And then he stilled and read it again and handed it to her without a word. It was dated 1869, 3 years after the survey, and it was a letter of inquiry addressed to the railroad's land office, asking after the price and availability of the Still Hollow parcel. And it was signed by a name she knew as well as her own by then, Ammon Thorne, Cyrus Thorne's father. The letter did not speak of grazing or of grass or of rounding out a holding. It spoke, in a rancher's blunt hand, of the underground water beneath the parcel, of the writer's belief that the spring there held significant worth to any man who could control the country's water in a dry season, and of his wish to acquire the ground before its value became widely understood. Adaline read it twice and felt the whole shape of the summer rearrange itself around a truth she had suspected, but never held in her hands. The Thorne interest in her land had not been born of the drought. It had not sprung from the convenient accident of two large parcels wanting the stone in the middle of the boot. It was older than she was. Ammon Thorne had known about the water under Still Hollow before Cyrus was grown, had reached for it once and been turned away, and the reaching had passed down through the family like the deed to a debt, until the son stood at her gate with fresh paint on a lock and a story about repairs. The gate, the lawsuit, the letter in the ledger, all of it, was not a response to what her daughter had found behind the shed. It was the resumption of a hunt 2 generations old. "He didn't want the land," she said aloud, more to the lamp than to Pruitt. "He never wanted the land. His father knew what was under it before I was born, and Cyrus grew up knowing it too. All this time I thought I was fighting a man who wanted my grass. I was fighting a man finishing something his father started." She folded the letter with a care that had gone cold and deliberate. "A locked gate, a dry ditch. He wasn't trying to run me off my land. He was trying to keep me from finding out what his family already knew was down there." Pruitt made her certified copies of everything before he locked the office, the survey, the determination, the easement, and the letter, stamping each with the company seal and signing his own name below it as the officer who had drawn them from the records, so that no lawyer in any hearing could call them forgeries a rancher's widow had cooked up in a barn. He would not take a cent for it. He walked her out into the cool of the rail yard, where the roundhouse breathed steam into the dark, and he shook her raw hand at the platform and told her to go home and win, and she boarded the westbound with the certified copies buttoned inside her coat against her heart and the cut ledger, useless now and precious as evidence of the crime, wrapped again in Finch's cloth. The 2 days home passed slower than the 2 days out, because now she carried something worth stealing, and she found she could not sleep against the glass as she had before, but sat upright through the night watches, with her coat buttoned and her hand pressed flat against the papers beneath it. watching the dark country slide past, and doing sums that had nothing to do with money. 5 days, Vane had counted, before the hearing. She had spent 3 of them reaching Fenwick Junction and finding the paper. The train would set her down at Hollis, with a single day to spare, if it held its schedule. And she spent the long dark hours on willing the wheels to keep their rhythm under her and praying no washout or hotbox stole the margin she had left. Wren met her on the Hollis platform in the gray of the 4th morning, having ridden in with Penrose's young helper, and the girl came across the planks at a dead run and buried her face against her mother's coat, against the very papers folded there. And for a moment, Adaline simply stood and held her daughter in the coal smoke and the early light, and let the arithmetic wait. The girl had kept the ranch. She had counted the cattle and set the canvas over the spring and carried water at dawn beside the hired boy, 10 years old and steady as a fence post. And when she finally pulled back to look up at her mother, her eyes searched her face for the answer to the only question that mattered. "I found it," Adaline said, and pressed her hand flat against the coat where the papers lay so the girl could feel the shape of them. "Every word they tried to cut out of the world, I found it whole, 300 miles from here. You found the water, Wren. I found the proof it was always ours. Between the 2 of us, we've done what a rich man's lawyers swore couldn't be done." She smoothed the girl's wind-tangled hair. "Now we go and make them stand still long enough to hear it." Ezra Vane read the certified copies at his desk above the harness shop with the morning light falling across the paper, and for a long while he said nothing at all, only turned the pages slowly. The survey, the determination, the easement, and last of all the letter. When he reached the letter, he set his spectacles down and pressed his fingers to his closed eyes, and when he opened them, there was something fierce burning under the gray weariness. "Ammon Thorne," he said, tapping the 1869 date. "This is the thing that turns it, Mrs. Merrow. Not the survey, though the survey wins the water. This letter wins the story. This proves the father knew, which proves the son knew, which means that gate was never about a repair and never about the drought. It was about keeping you ignorant of a right his family had coveted for 30 years. He gathered the pages into a careful stack. A man can argue about interpretation of an old survey. He cannot argue his own father's handwriting, saying he wanted the ground for the water under it. That letter makes a liar of every word he's put in the newspaper. There was time still, in the day that remained, for one more piece to fall, and it fell not from an archive, but from the conscience of a man who had spent 20 years looking at the ground. Amos Doyle came out to Alder Bench that afternoon, alone on his own horse, and he sat it a long while at the yard gate before he dismounted, turning his hat slowly in his hands like a man working himself up to a cold plunge. Adaline came out to meet him, and Wren she sent inside with a look, and Doyle stood in the yard unable to bring his eyes up from his boots for the first part of what he had ridden out to say. "I've turned this over more nights than I care to count," he began, the words coming slow and heavy. "I told myself it wasn't my business. A man's got to keep his place, keep his job, keep his mouth shut, and draw his wage. 20 years I've drawn Thorne's wage." He finally lifted his head, and his weathered face was drawn tight with the particular misery of a decent man who has stood too long beside a thing that was not decent. "The head gate on the Antler never was closed for repairs, Mrs. Merrow. There wasn't a lick of repair work ordered or done. He had the flow turned into a new holding pond he'd built for the pasture he's opening on the far side. I oversaw the diversion myself, on his say-so. I've watched you haul water 9 miles all summer, knowing the whole time your ditch was running fine into his pond." The confession landed with the weight of a thing long suspected finally spoken aloud, and Adaline held very still under it, afraid that any word might spook him back into the 20 years of silence he had just broken. Doyle reached into his coat and drew out a folded paper, soft along its creases from being carried and reconsidered, and he held it out to her. "That's a copy of the operations log," he said. "The diversion, dated. His signature at the bottom, authorizing it. I made the copy myself, weeks ago, before I ever knew what I meant to do with it." His hand did not quite steady as she took it. I'm not ready to stand up in front of the commission and say all this to his face. I've got a wife, and I've years yet to work, and no other outfit in this county will hire the man who broke Cyrus Thorne. But you take the log. You take it, and you use it, and if it comes to where my name on paper is the only thing that'll finish it, you send for me, and I'll come. I'm just not there yet. God help me, I'm not there yet. Adaline took the log and did not push him past the line he had drawn, because she understood the courage it had already cost him to cross the ground he had crossed. You've carried this all summer, she said quietly, folding the log in with the certified copies. That's a heavier load than any water I hauled. A man who finally sets down a wrong he's been carrying doesn't owe an apology for how long it took him to set it down. He owes it to himself never to pick it up again. Doyle looked at her a moment with something like gratitude and something like shame warring in his face. Then he mounted and rode off toward the far parcel, sitting his horse a little straighter than he had come. Word of her return reached Thorne within the day, as everything did, and his answer was swift and told her more than any threat could have. He rode out himself that evening, and the offer he brought had changed its whole character. He did not speak of repairs now, or of stewardship, or of the danger a green owner posed to shared water. He named a figure nearly double the ranch's worth in a good year, an outlandish sum for 74 acres of grass and gravel, and he asked in return only that she sign a strict agreement of confidentiality along with the sale, that whatever she had found and whatever she had learned go silent with her signature. She understood then, standing in her own yard with the certified copies buttoned against her heart. Exactly what frightened Cyrus Thorne. It was not the spring. A spring on a small ranch, however good, was a thing a man of his holdings could have lived alongside. What he could not live alongside was the light. The confidentiality clause was the tell. He was not trying to buy her water any longer. He was trying to buy her silence about a diversion that would not survive being looked at, and a family hunt that would not survive being spoken of. And the moment she saw that, the enormous figure lost every ounce of its pull. "Put your money away, Mr. Thorne," she said, and she did not raise her voice, because the quiet of it carried further than shouting would have. "You're not offering to buy my land. You're offering to buy my mouth. And I've spent this whole summer learning exactly how much a thing is worth by watching you try to take it cheap." She looked at him steadily across the gate that had shut in his face once before. Water doesn't belong to whoever builds the tallest fence. It belongs to whoever holds the right to it and respects what it's worth. You've never understood the second half of that in your life, and it's going to cost you the first half in front of the commission. He left without another word, and the set of his shoulders as he rode off told her the money had been his last easy move, and he knew it. She did not spend the eve of the hearing sharpening accusations. She spent it, on Vane's counsel, building the opposite of Thorne's secrecy. With Penrose, she prepared the plain facts of the spring. The test the Hollis physician had run on a sealed jar of the water, and pronounced sound, with only simple settling and filtering needed before it touched a cup. The measured flow holding past 40 gallons a minute under the canvas, a modest and honest plan for how the water would actually be used, house and herd, and greenhouse first, surplus held in reserve. Vane sent word to the smaller ranchers of Harrow Valley, the ones who ran a few hundred head against the same dry sky, and Adaline stood before a room of them in the Grange Hall the night before the hearing, her hands steady only because she had practiced holding the pages the evening before in front of the washstand mirror, until the numbers no longer caught in her throat. She did not promise them a river. She told them flow rates and filtering and the limits of what one spring could bear. She told them the water would serve Alder Bench first, that any surplus would go to a neighbor in a true emergency and never to a buyer for profit, and that she would put every measure of it on paper open for any of them to read. It was not the speech of a woman claiming a prize. It was the accounting of a woman offering to share a burden, and it was the plainness of it. More than any single figure, that turned the room. She watched the suspicion the ledger had planted in their faces give way to something else, and she understood that Thorne's great mistake had been to make his fight in the dark, where hers could be made in the light. He asked you to trust that a big man knows best what to do with the county's water, she told them, near the end, when she felt the room had come with her. I'm not asking you to trust me at all. I'm asking you to read the paper. Every drop, every limit, every promise, written down where you can hold me to it. A man who hides his numbers is telling you something about his numbers. I'm putting mine on the table. One of the older ranchers, a man who had crossed the street from her in Hollis a month before, met her eyes across the hall and gave her a slow nod, and it was worth more to her than the money Thorne had offered. Doyle's log did its quiet work in the hours before the hearing, passed to Harlan Wick, through Vane, and Wick, faced with a signed diversion he could no longer treat as a neighborly quarrel, had no choice but to open an emergency review of the Antler Headgate. His inspectors rode out at first light on the morning of the hearing itself and found what the log had promised: an unauthorized secondary line running off the Antler into Thorne's new holding pond, a line that appeared on no filing, no permit, no map in the county's books. The gate had never been closed for repair. It had been closed to steal the flow, and the theft now stood documented in the commission's own inspection. The hearing convened at mid-morning in a plain municipal room, off the courthouse, low-ceilinged and lit by tall windows, and a row of gas lamps hissing along the wall, filled with rows of wooden chairs that held more of Harrow Valley than Adaline had expected to see. Neighbors who had looked away all summer sat shoulder to shoulder along the back wall. She kept her eyes on the three commissioners at their table rather than on Thorne, aware that meeting his gaze would only remind her how many rooms like this one he had walked into, believing the outcome already bent his way. He arrived with three lawyers from the capital firm, ranged around him like a fence, confident in the sheer weight of them. And his lead attorney opened by speaking at length of the scale of Thorne land and cattle, its herds, its acreage, its place as the largest employer in the valley, inviting the commission to weigh the interests of so substantial an enterprise against those of one small, struggling family. Vane did not rise to argue about size, and his refusal to take that bait was itself a kind of answer. When his turn came, he did not raise his voice or reach for a flourish. He walked the commission through the paper in order, each document laid on the evidence table as he named it. Building not a passion but a wall. The 1866 survey, certified under the seal of the very railroad that had once owned the ground Thorne now ran. The determination, whole, recording that the still hollow right ran with the land and had never lapsed. The easement across the Thorne parcel. And when Thorne's lead attorney rose to declare flatly that Mrs. Merrow had never held any legitimate right to the still hollow source, that whatever old survey she waived was inconclusive and superseded, Vane simply drew the certified determination from the stack and set it before the commissioners, and let them read in the surveyor's own hand the finding the lawyer had just sworn did not exist. My client's opponent tells you there is no right, Vane said, his voice mild in the quiet room. The railroad that granted his own land begs to differ, in writing, under seal. This is not Mrs. Merrow's account of the matter. It is the Overland and Western's own record, which somebody found valuable enough to cut from the county's copy with a knife. We have the wound. Now you have seen the paper that made the wound necessary. Penrose testified next, plain and unhurried, to the geology of the thing, laying out with his survey figures that the still hollow source rose from its own isolated formation in the rock, distinct from and unconnected to the wells that watered Thorne's herds, so that the whole claim of a shared and endangered underground supply collapsed under the weight of his measurements. There was no common source for Alder Bench to threaten. There were two separate waters, and only one of them had ever been touched, and the man who had touched it was not the woman at the small table. Then Vane laid down the letter, and the room changed. He read the date aloud, 1869, and the name, Ammon Thorne, and he read the writer's plain words about the worth of the water beneath, still hollow, and his wish to secure the ground before that worth was widely known. And he set the letter before the commissioners beside the survey, and he let the arithmetic of the two dates do its own work. The father had known in 69. The son had grown up knowing. The gate had gone up not to repair a head gate, but to keep a woman from discovering a thing Thorne family had wanted for 30 years and been unable to buy. Cyrus Thorne lost his composure then, and the losing of it was the last testimony the room needed. He came half out of his chair, his voice rising in a way it never had at her gate, accusing her of trying to tear down the reputation of a family that had helped build the whole town, of scheming to ruin a name that meant something in a county where hers meant nothing. Adaline rose from the small table, and she answered him without heat, in the level voice she had used on him all summer, the voice that had never once given him the satisfaction of her fear. "I'm not taking your reputation, Mr. Thorne," she said, and every chair in the room had gone still to hear it. "I haven't said a single word against you that isn't written down in your own family's hand. If your name can't survive your own father's letter and your own signature on a diversion, then it wasn't your reputation you were protecting all along. It was the truth you were hiding behind it." Doyle's log went before the commission last, entered through Vane without Doyle in the chair, the signed diversion authorizing the theft of the flow with no maintenance order anywhere behind it, and beside it, the inspector's fresh finding of the unauthorized line running that very morning into Thorne's holding pond. Vane laid one final paper down atop the rest, a notice Adaline had turned up in the ranch's own file once she knew to look for it, showing that Thorne had scheduled a formal appraisal of Alder Bench for a date just 3 weeks after the water was cut, meaning to buy the ranch once its value had fallen with the loss of its only known water. The gate, the drought's cover, the falling offers, the letter in the paper, all of it resolved now into a single deliberate design, the driving down of a widow's land ahead of a purchase already planned. The commission did not deliberate long. They rejected Thorne's request for an order barring Adaline from the spring, and, in its place, they issued an order of their own, directing Thorne land and cattle to reopen the Antler Headgate, restore its original flow to the Merrow parcel, and submit to independent oversight of the ditch going forward. The unauthorized diversion, they referred to the Territorial Water Authority for a full audit, and Cyrus Thorne, who had once stood at her gate and told her that a small woman could never afford to fight a man with lawyers on retainer, was ordered to reimburse Adaline Merrow for every dollar she had spent hauling water from the Bittern River during the weeks his gate had stood shut, so that the man who had tried to bankrupt her now owed her for every barrel she had dragged 9 miles to keep her herd alive. She did not feel, driving home in the long gold light of that evening, the soaring thing she might once have imagined feeling. She felt instead the deep bone-tiredness that comes only after a person finally sets down a weight carried too long, and beneath it a quiet gratitude with no room in it for gloating. Wren was waiting on the porch step when the wagon came up the track, and Adaline climbed down stiff, dust-worn, and gathered her daughter in, and told her only that it was over, that they were going to be all right now without laying out the whole of it, because some victories belong more to relief than to triumph, and a child does not need the ledger of a fight to know that her mother has come home standing. The order was one thing. The water running was another, and the days that followed taught Adaline that a ruling on paper and a ditch full of water are separated by a great deal of a rich man's reluctance. Thorne reopened the Antler Headgate because the commission had left him no room to do otherwise, but he did it slowly and grudgingly, and the independent overseer the order required had to ride out twice before the flow was set to its proper measure and left there. The audit the commission had referred upward moved on its own unhurried clock, and word came back through Vane that the territorial authority meant to make an example of the unauthorized line, that fines were coming and oversight along with them, and that Thorne land and cattle would spend the next several years operating with an inspector's eye on its every diversion. It was not the ruin some in the valley had hoped to see. It was something better and quieter than ruin, the slow settling of consequence onto a man who had believed himself above it. She turned her attention to the spring, and to doing the thing right that, the summer had nearly cost her the chance to do at all. The commission granted the permit to restore the still hollow intake, and Penrose oversaw the work himself, a proper stone-set catch-hatch basin where the old spring house had stood, a settling tank, and a simple sand filter of the kind the Hollis physician had recommended, and a storage cistern dug into the cool of the hillside. Adaline held the flow deliberately below what the permit allowed, drawing only what the house and the herd and the greenhouse truly needed and leaving the rest to rise and rest, as it always had, because she had learned in the collapse of the arch that water taken greedily was water lost, and she did not mean to make that mistake a second time. The cottonwoods behind the shed stayed green through the worst of the heat, and the pasture nearest the intake began, week by week, to remember what it was to be a pasture. The neighbors who had turned their faces from her in the spring came back slowly, the way such things come back, not with apologies, but with small, ordinary kindnesses that stood in for them. A rancher left a sack of seed potatoes on her porch without a note. Another mended a stretch of her boundary fence that had gone down in a windstorm while she was away and would not hear of being paid for it. And out of those small returnings, and out of the plain, honest reckoning she had laid before them in the Grange Hall, grew the things she had not planned and could not have built alone. 4 of the smaller outfits in Harrow Valley came to her one evening and sat around her kitchen table, and by the light of the same lamp she had done, her desperate arithmetic under all summer, they drew up the first articles of what they agreed to call the Still Hollow Ditch Association, a mutual company holding a shared emergency reserve against the dry years. Everyone in the valley knew were coming again. It was not built to sell water for profit, and Adaline wrote that plainly into the first article so that no future season could bend it otherwise. It was built to hold water back, to keep a common reserve that any member could draw on in a true emergency, and to share among all of them the cost of the paper and the surveys and the legal defense that had nearly broken her when she stood alone. She found herself explaining flume grades in water law and the reading of an old survey to men who had ranched these hills their whole lives, and she understood, watching them lean in over the lamplit table, that the isolation she had spent years mistaking for independence had never once served her the way she had told herself it did. A person alone could be cut off with a single gate. A company could not. I spent a long time believing that needing no one was the same as being strong, she told them, near the end of that first meeting when the articles were drawn and the coffee had gone cold. It isn't. A man with a gate proved that to me this summer. The strongest thing in this valley isn't the biggest herd or the deepest pocket. It's a room full of people who've agreed to hold the same line, and who've written it down where nobody can quietly cut it out later. The county recognized the association as an emergency reserve within the year, and the small, steady payment that came with the designation let Adaline do what 4 hard seasons had not: pay down the note the bank had fretted over, rebuild the herd she had sold into at a loss, and at last mend the greenhouse roof that had leaked since before the trouble began. She rebuilt it for drought-hardy vegetables and ran a simple gravity line to it off the cistern, a drip of water threaded to the roots so that scarcely a drop went to waste. And the greenhouse that had been a patched and hopeful thing became quietly the most productive ground on the ranch. The association's first true test came the following summer, when a dry lightning storm walked the ridge above town and set the grass alight along the crest. The men who fought it filled their barrels straight from the Still Hollow Reserve wagon after wagon, rolling up the ridge road with water. Adaline's spring had held against exactly such a day, and they turned the fire before it reached the 2 nearest homesteads and drove it back onto the bare rock where it starved for want of fuel. Wren watched the whole of it from the safety of the porch, kept well back from the ridge with the other children of the valley while the men and the water did their work. And when it was over and the smoke had thinned off the crest, no one in Kestrel County spoke of Adaline Merrow any longer as the newcomer who had bought in, without checking her water rights. Thorne did not lose everything, and the story of that summer was never one in which he should have. He lost the unauthorized line, which the audit forced him to close for good, and because he had expanded his herd on the strength of water he had never been entitled to, he found himself short of it. In the hottest stretch of the following year, his new pasture browning while the reserve his neighbors had built ran cool and full. His own foreman put the notion to him, and in the end there was no other water to be had. And so the thing came full circle in a way Adaline could not have arranged if she had tried. Cyrus Thorne rode out to Alder Bench and stood in the yard where he had once told her the ranch would die of thirst, and asked to buy water from the association she had built out of the wreckage of his scheming. He tried, even then, to buy his way to the front of the line, offering to pay well above the rate the other members paid, in exchange for priority access ahead of them. Adaline heard him out, and then she refused the special terms without heat and without gloating, and told him he could have surplus water at exactly the rate every other member paid and not a cent's worth of advantage more, on the single condition that he sign a written agreement restoring the Antler flow in full and forever, and withdrawing every claim, spoken or filed, to the still hollow spring. He signed it in her yard before the county representative who had ridden out to witness it, and Adaline did not raise her voice or savor the moment, and the restraint in her was worth more than any triumph could have been. Water doesn't belong to whoever builds the tallest fence, she told him again, quietly, as he folded his copy of the agreement away, the same words she had spoken across the gate in the worst of it. It belongs to whoever holds the right to it and respects what it's worth. You've had a whole summer to learn the difference, Mr. Thorne. I hope some of it took. A year on, Alder Bench had changed, though not into some grander version of itself that would have rung false against everything the place was. Adaline still did most of the work with her own two hands, still rose before the sun cleared the eastern rim, still watched the sky and the price of hay with the wariness any rancher carries in the Merrow. What was gone was the other thing, the constant cold awareness that everything could be taken from her overnight by a man with a weld and a lawyer and a story. The ran green through the dry months. The herd stood in good flesh. The association had grown by 2 more members, and the small landowners who had once stayed silent for fear of crossing Cyrus Thorne had come to understand that shared records and shared costs and a right written plainly into a company's articles gave them a protection none of them had ever held alone. Near the shed, close to where the old springhouse had stood, collapsed and forgotten for 30 years and more, Wren set up a small sign she had lettered herself, the paint carefully worked in her steady, watchful hand, reading still hollow, found again. Adaline stood beside her daughter in the early light and watched clear water move steadily into the catch basin, and she remembered the morning Cyrus Thorne had told her the ranch would die of thirst, and how in one narrow sense he had been right all along, for water truly had decided the future of that valley. He had only been wrong about who deserved to hold it, and wrong to believe that a locked gate could settle the question for good. Wren crouched at the edge of the overflow pool, where the surplus spread thin and cold across the stones, and she chose one small stone from the collection, cupped in her palm, and set it into the shallow water, and watched the ripples run out from it and settle. She had picked that one, she said, for the thin white vein that ran through it, because it put her in mind of the crack in the old wall where the moss had grown, the place where all of it had truly begun. Adaline laughed softly, surprised as she so often was by how closely her daughter watched the world, by how much a child could carry of a thing the grown people around her walked straight past without seeing. They stayed out by the spring longer than the morning's chores allowed for, in no hurry to break the quiet, letting the sound of moving water fill the space between them where words were not needed. Adaline thought of all the dawns she had woken, dreading the hollow knock of an empty barrel, and of how strange it was to stand here, now listening to water that had been running steady beneath her feet the whole of that terrible summer, waiting only to be found. She thought of Cyrus Thorne, without anger now, with something closer to plain understanding, the recognition that a man could spend his whole life mistaking control for ownership and never once noticed the difference until the day it was taken from him. And she thought of the two who had come before, the unknown hand that had laid the spring house stone by stone, and then, cornered by some larger neighbor of an older day, had chosen to bury the water rather than let it be seized, and Ammon Thorne, who had wanted it badly enough to write for it and to pass the wanting down. The difference this time was that the burying had not held. This time a watchful child had knelt at a cold wall and felt what did not belong. And everything a rich man's father had reached for, and a rich man's knife had tried to erase, had risen anyway, patient and clear, into the hands of the very kind of person it had always been meant to serve. Alder Bench was no larger than it had been before, and it was never going to make Adaline wealthy in the way Cyrus Thorne understood wealth. It was steadier now, though, built on ground she understood completely at last, down to the cold water running beneath it, and that kind of steadiness was worth more to her than anything a bank could count. She brushed the dust from her knees and reached down to help her daughter to her feet, and the two of them walked back toward the house together as the sun climbed fully over the ridge, and out across the pasture, the grass had begun to turn green again, fed by water that ran steady and unhidden beneath the morning light, while the steel gate that had once sealed off the Antler stood pulled from its posts and hauled away for good.